Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the first episode of Intimate Judaism on JewishCoffeehouse.com, where a rabbi and a therapist discuss intimacy, relationships, marriage, and sex through the prism of Jewish law and thought. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn, and I'm joined by my co-host, Talli Rosenbaum. Hi, Talli.
Hi, Scott. You're the rabbi. I'm the therapist.
Yes, let's make that clear from the beginning. And I'm so excited to do this with you. I think this is going to be a great podcast.
I'm looking forward. I enjoyed our first podcast together, and this is coming out of the desire to keep it going.
Yeah, that first podcast was an episode of our podcast series, Orthodox Conundrum, and it was all about masturbation, Jewish law, and teaching our children in a healthy manner. We have actually taken that episode of the Orthodox Conundrum and made it into episode 1 of this series of Intimate Judaism. So when you look back at our list of episodes, that's now episode 1, and this will be episode 2. So you should definitely listen to that. But from now on, this podcast is going to be where Talli and I, every month, are going to discuss various issues of sexuality and Jewish law. And today's topic is about raising our daughters to be sexually healthy while at the same time raising them as Orthodox Jews. And Talli, while officially this topic is about raising sexually healthy Orthodox daughters, the truth is most of what we're saying here applies equally well to raising Orthodox sons as it does to raising Orthodox daughters. Today's topic is actually based on an article that Talli wrote for the Times of Israel called 10 Tips for Raising Sexually Healthy Orthodox Daughters. If you want a copy of this, you can go to Talli's website, tallirosenbaum.com, Talli Rosenbaum.com. You can also find it on our website, intimatejudaism.com.
We are actually very interested in hearing from our listeners as well as to the topics that you would like to hear about. It looks like this is going to be a two-parter. We're going to spend some of the time today talking about tips for raising sexually healthy young daughters. If you have any comments or questions or ideas for future podcast episodes, please email us at
intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com.
Thanks, Scott.
So before we get into today's topic, I first want to talk a little bit, just for a minute, about what this podcast is all about.
Yes, the name of this podcast is Intimate Judaism, where we will be talking about relationships, marriage, sexuality, and love, using the Torah and the sources to guide us in our conversation.
And this discussion is going to be respectful, but at the same time, forthright and honest. Now, I'll point out also from the very outset that I am not a posek. I'm not a halachic decisor. And even though I will try my best to always present what Jewish law says fairly and accurately, please don't act on anything I say until you speak to your local halachic authority. Talli and I both want to help married couples better understand healthy sexuality and thereby improve their physical and emotional relationships. We want to assist parents in raising their children to be Torah observant, emotionally healthy, and sexually healthy. Our goal is to help all members of the Orthodox community, single, married, parents, educators, Haredi, modern Orthodox. Sexuality and intimacy are seldom discussed for reasons that we'll probably talk about on this podcast, and as a consequence, there's lots of ignorance and misinformation. Our job is to dispel the ignorance as well as to correct the misinformation, and in so doing, hopefully we will help people live lives as committed Orthodox Jews who also live lives as sexually fulfilled and emotionally happy people.
Absolutely. I would anticipate that even now, as some people are listening, they're wondering, how can it be that two people can sit and talk on a public podcast about topics which hatzniut yafala, that we are used to keeping in very small forums. The essence of tzniut is that we don't talk about these things in public, and we need to acknowledge that. However, we also believe that in the creation and development of healthy relationships and of marriage in the spirit of Jewish values, we need to be able to educate, we need to be able to provide help, and we need to be able to acknowledge that if we don't talk about these issues openly, this work will be done by the media in ways that don't necessarily reflect Jewish values.
Part of the problem nowadays is that in the environment in which we live, with social media and the internet and so on and so forth, either we teach people or someone else is going to teach them. There's no option of leaving it blank anymore. So Talli, before we begin today's topic, just tell us a little bit about who you are.
So I am a couples therapist primarily, and an individual therapist. I'm a certified sex therapist. I also have a background in sexual medicine, but I mostly do regular old talk therapy.
And I'm an Orthodox rabbi, as I mentioned. For 11 years, I ran a yeshiva in the Beit Shemesh area called Yeshivat Yesodei HaTorah. I also have taught many, many students the laws of Taharat HaMishpacha, the laws of sexual purity, in anticipation of their getting married. So in both of those contexts, as well as other contexts, I've come across many of the topics that you and I are going to discuss, Talli. And hopefully over the course of this podcast, I'll learn a lot, and hopefully our listeners will learn a lot too.
I look forward to learning a lot from you as well.
Thank you. So let's get on to today's topic, which, as we mentioned, is all about tzniut and raising our daughters to be healthy Orthodox Jews who also have a healthy sense of self and a healthy sense of sexuality. And in order to do that, I want to open up reading a Gemara in Masechet Brachot, Daf Kaf Daled Amud Aleph, which is not the only Gemara that talks about this clearly, but I think frames the issue in a very important way. And the Gemara reads as follows. Amar Rav Yitzchak. Rav Yitzchak says, Tefach ba'isha erva. A handbreadth, which is a relatively small amount, of a woman, an uncovered part of a woman, is considered nakedness. So the Gemara then asks, Lamai, what is this referring to? What halachic ramifications does this have? Ilema listakuleba, if we're talking about looking at a woman, meaning that it's forbidden to look at a tefach, an uncovered tefach on a woman, v'ha'am Rav Sheshet, but didn't Rav Sheshet say? Lama mana hakatuv tachshitin shebachutz im tachshitim shebifnim. Why did the Torah, in discussing the various spoils of the war with Midian, put the jewelry women wore on the outside together in the list with jewelry that women wore under their clothes? Lomar lach, in order to teach you, kol mistakel be'etzba ketana shel isha, any person, any man, who looks even at a woman's little finger, ki'ilu mistakel makom hatoref. It's as if he's looking at literally the place of obscenity, which refers to a woman's private parts. In other words, this Gemara is saying that it can't mean that one can't look at an uncovered tefach, that an uncovered tefach is what is prohibited from looking at, because we know even looking at something much smaller than that, even looking at the smallest amount of a woman, less than a tefach, for the sake of getting pleasure, is prohibited. And then the Gemara goes on and explains that a tefach on a woman being uncovered is referring to saying Shema in front of her and so on and so forth. We don't have to get into that now for our purposes. But what I want to point out about this Gemara, Talli, is this. This seems to be saying, as a basic source for us to use, that a woman must be tsanua, modest in an extreme way. It's saying that a woman has to be completely covered. At least it seems like it's saying that a man can't get any pleasure out of looking at a woman, and that by inference, a woman has to make sure that she's dressed in an appropriate way. And along with that, because it seems to be so absolute, I think very often in Orthodox communities, there's nothing to talk about. Simply that leads to, okay, a girl has to be tsanua, and that's the end of the story, and that's where the conversation ends. On the other hand, without questioning the reality of this halacha, we also want to raise our girls to have a positive body image and not to think that sex is a dirty thing. So let me give the floor to you. How do you do with this Gemara?
I'm happy that you brought this Gemara. I think it's actually quite a beautiful Gemara that is teaching us something. And I think the question we need to ask is, what is this Gemara trying to teach? Is this Gemara teaching women that they have to cover up every amah of their bodies because looking at their hand is like looking at their private parts? I don't believe that that is the message of this Gemara. I believe what the Gemara is teaching men to do is that they should understand that if they look at a woman's hand the way that they would look at her private parts, it is objectifying. And I kind of think this has something to do with the words that came before about the spoils of Midian and the tachshitim mibachutz, the outward jewelry and the inward jewelry. I think that it is a hint to look past the exterior, that there's an interior, and that intimacy is not about gratifying your own needs through objectifying a woman, and it doesn't matter if it's her hand or something else. There is a very deep message about how women and men should be interacting, should be relating. And I don't believe that the Torah wants men to look at women in this manner of objectification. And that's the real message.
It's very interesting you look at the Gemara that way, because certainly that's in accord with the very well-known psak, the very well-known ruling of the Rosenbaum, who says that if a person is really sick, perhaps lovesick, whatever it is exactly, and he says the only way that he's going to live is if he looks at a certain woman, the Rambam says you can't do it. You can't allow him to look at her. You can't even let him speak to her from behind a curtain where he's not even looking at her. The message, I believe, of which is that there's no room for objectification of women in Jewish law.
You can't use a woman in order to gratify your own needs.
Or even for the sake of life. It's still objectifying. Objectifying is simply not allowed in any context.
So the interesting part about this discussion to me is how passages from our sources can be understood in one way, but can also be corrupted and understood in another way, which is that it is the responsibility of a woman to cover up completely because a man, Rahman al-Islam, does not have control over his passions, and it is the job of the woman to protect the man from his sexual lust or his sexual drive.
And you're saying you don't think that's what that Gemara is talking about?
I don't think that's what this Gemara is talking about, no.
Okay, but at the same time, Talli, we have to acknowledge that there are other sources. I have, for example, in front of me right now, the Even Ezer Siman Kaf Aleph. Anyone can look it up in the Shulchan Aruch or the Aruch HaShulchan, where it does say that a woman does have an obligation in terms of what she wears and the way she covers her hair and so on and so forth. So it's not as though a woman has no responsibility whatsoever, even if we understand the Gemara that we have over there in Rav Sheitz's statement, not in those terms. Clearly, these terms do exist.
Absolutely. And we're going to find sources which talk about women's responsibility, but we're also going to find sources, and we need to balance those sources with the sources that present tzniut in the frame of modest behavior, that it's about dignity, it's about behavior, it's about being internal and not overly external.
You know, I'll give you an example of one of those sources, actually a source which is often cited for extreme tzniut, but when one looks at what it's actually saying, if we want to talk about reframing, which I think is the key point you're making, it really fits into that. And that is the source, I believe it comes from the Zohar, which talks about even the walls of a person's house should not ever see a woman's hair uncovered. Now, admittedly, most people don't paskin like that. The Mishnah Berurah does cite it. And when one looks at that at first, one thinks, wow, what an extreme statement. But think about what it's saying. It's not about men. Has nothing to do with it. It's about somebody's internal dignity. In other words, whether or not that's the practical halacha, and I think the vast majority of people would say it is not the practical halacha, leaving aside whether or not we use the Zohar for halacha in general, which is a whole separate question. But listen to what it's saying. It's saying it's about her own dignity, and it allows us, it gives us the permission to reframe much of tzniut in terms of other things, because we're no longer talking about you're doing this for the sake of men. If you're doing it for the walls of your house, it's about you.
And on the other hand, you mentioned the Zohar not necessarily being a primary source of halacha. The Mishnah would certainly qualify.
I think so.
In the first
if I didn't say that, I'd be in big trouble.
In the first Seder of the Mishnah in Zraim in Challah, I just learned it. It discusses the situation of a woman taking challah naked.
Right.
And it says...
And saying a bracha on it at that time.
Saying a bracha. And that a woman can say a bracha completely naked. She can prepare the challah, take the challah naked, because her genitalia are pretty internal and she can just cover them up by crossing her legs.
Unlike a man who can't do that.
Yes.
In the context over there.
Yeah. Which I believe is a source that nakedness in and of itself is not necessarily something shameful, and it's something that clearly was done in the privacy of one's own home.
Now that we've presented these issues on the table here, that a big part of what we have to do with these sources is reframe them in terms of the way we teach them as much as anything else. It doesn't change the halacha, it changes the way that we want to present them. Let's talk a little bit about how to raise sexually healthy daughters in an Orthodox context.
Well, I think that one good example would be in teaching of that Mishnah in Challah. And that kind of takes the shame away from the body. Your body.
So when you're
is
teaching
not a
your girls
shameful
how to
thing.
make challah, you're going to add a little extra detail over there,
Well,
right?
I think that being in there is there for a reason. And there's something we can learn from that. There is something to be said for those sorts of situations. One might say, well, the Mishnah has to bring every single possible...
Or maybe if not every possible one, more extreme situations to say, how does the halacha work? Very often we'll give an extreme case to say, what would be the case here? Because medium, middle of the road cases don't teach you very much. Only extreme cases teach you.
But I think that we can use opportunities such as that kind of source to say, look, the Mishnah brings about a situation that must have existed. And what can we learn from this? And what is the public domain and what is the private domain? And how do we be in our own intimate personal space as we value our own relationship with our bodies, as well as holding space for what's appropriate in the public sphere?
So, that actually leads us to something which you wrote. You wrote an article a couple of years ago in the Times of Israel, which was called 10 Tips for Raising Sexually Healthy Orthodox Daughters, one of which is what we're talking about now. You said, when kids ask questions about sex, parents should provide open and honest answers at a level appropriate to the child's age. If adults do not provide accurate information, children are forced to rely on their peers or other potentially inaccurate sources, and don't whitewash body parts. Okay, can you elaborate a bit on this,
Yeah,
Talli?
but I'm going to step back for 1 second because we're not going to have time to talk about all 10 tips. So I do want to make a point. I hope that we'll have a follow-up and we can talk about some of the other things. But what I'd like to make a point about is that sexual development is like any sort of development, cognitive, physical, spiritual. We develop in life from the time that we are born, we develop. And when we talk about sexuality, it's not just something that we do. It is who we are. It is a part of ourselves. And it has to do somewhat with information that we receive. So it's the cognitive development, the understanding of gender, of privacy, of attraction. So that's one component is cognitive. Another component is emotional. In order to be sexual, we need to have certain feelings about letting go, being vulnerable, feeling safe, feeling desire, motivation for pleasure. Those are all emotionally based parts of developing sexuality and sexual health. Another component is the physical. What we need to have everything working physically, and we want to have a sense of our physical self. And we'll get to that in a moment as well. But you asked Dafka about the cognitive. How do we know about it? And how we know about it is that we have a language to talk about it. We don't ignore body parts. We have words for them. We answer our children's questions because curiosity is a precursor to sexuality. And
in a positive way.
In a positive way, absolutely. You know, you're walking down the street with your 3-year-old and he sees, a pregnant woman and he says, how did she get like that? That's curiosity. It's not overtly about sexuality. He doesn't know that he's asking about sexuality, but that curiosity about boys versus girls, that's a very normal part of development. And we want to be able to facilitate discussion and not shame our kids and not tell them that, no, we don't ask those kinds of questions.
So what does one do? I know that all parents, I'm a parent, you're a parent, we have sometimes a difficult time talking about these things with our kids. They're uncomfortable because these are things which for ourselves are very, very private. How do you make sure that you can both encompass the idea of being tsanua and not saying things that perhaps this child is not ready to hear, along with being comfortable talking to your kids about sexuality in a healthy way?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And I think that just like we don't have kids with all the rules of how to put them to bed and what to give them to eat, we do our homework and we work on becoming more comfortable by reading books and taking workshops and, doing our own work, whether it's in therapy or just processing it with other people.
Going to Rosenbaum.com and reading the stuff there, right? Yeah.
Right. I mean, just learning about things because we are who we are. We just become this way because of the way we developed, because of how our parents raised us, and just being aware of that, being aware of what we're uncomfortable with, and being authentic and honest. You can be authentic about not being comfortable about something, and that's okay.
And do you think that you should use the proper names for various body parts as opposed to euphemisms?
I do.
Why is that important?
Well, I think that if you don't use a euphemism for a child's nose, but you use a euphemism for his penis, that already sends the message that there's something not okay about that body part. And I think that we also don't want to infantilize sexuality as something that's childish. Also, as I wrote in the article, how is a girl supposed to tell her mother what hurts her, what itches her, if she doesn't really have a name for those body parts?
Just in a practical level, it's very important to be able to say them.
Yeah. And, when I was working with very young women, new kalot, and I still do, it is unbelievable sometimes how disconnected they are. They're going to get married, and yet they don't have any sense of their own bodies or their genitals.
What do you mean they don't have any sense of it?
Well, they don't know the basic anatomy of their own bodies because it's been framed as completely irrelevant to them. And it's not. It's part of your body.
Let's talk about the next item on the list. Each of these, of course, could be its own episode, frankly. You also wrote another tip that use media as an opportunity. Now, especially in the Orthodox community, we're here in Israel right now, so many people look at the media as an enemy, and frankly, with good reason, because so much of what appears on, whether it's television, the internet, movies, is sexually demeaning, once again, objectifying women, frankly, objectifying men too. How can you use the media as an opportunity? I think most people would rather, if they could, say, just shut it off. I don't want to even have it in my house whatsoever.
Well, it's interesting because there's a lot of demeaning, undignified, and even scary behavior in violent movies as well. And people don't seem to have as much of a reactivity to that as sexual content. So let's be honest that sexual content scares parents. And if we're seeing objectifying, violent, gratuitous portrayals, which are not about consent, then certainly we will want to filter what our children are watching. But our children are going to be seeing, most of them are going to have some sort of exposure. And what we want to do is we want to process that exposure with them. We want to teach them that even though they are seeing, this might be the only sexual reference they have. They're not engaging in sexual behaviors, or they're not reading books about sex or watching educational sexual films in their yeshivas. So the only thing that they may refer to in their experience of learning is what they've seen. And so we want to use the opportunity to process what they saw and fix it, talk about it.
How do you use this opportunity? What does that even mean?
Well, let's take the classic example of children watching television and then there being a kissing scene. And a mother, runs to the TV to turn it off. She may not turn off the TV if there's a bloody, violent war going on, but for a kissing scene, she'll turn it off. And I'll say, look, let's use that opportunity. Why did the boy kiss the girl, or why did the girl kiss the boy? Did he ask her first? Do you think she liked to be kissed? I think it's an opportunity to talk about what you saw and how you process that. What do you think about it? What do you feel about it? Or if you see an ad, a big, huge billboard, and, you could say, oh, what a slut. You can shame the billboard model. Or you could say, what do you think about the way they're selling this brand of cars and using this woman? And I think it's an opportunity to talk about objectification, to talk about media and how women, men, sexuality is portrayed.
I want to go back to the example of kissing on television, which frankly on TV now is very, very mild compared to what they might see. But still, how does a parent balance that? Because on the one hand, you say, oh, did he ask consent? Or however you phrase it to your child, do you think he and she liked it? Why do you think they did that? How would a parent who wants to teach his child that I don't really want you doing that before you're married, if that's the parent's value, how is he supposed to integrate that value while at the same time teaching the child about not objectifying women without turning it into this big forbidden act?
It's not just about not objectifying women. It's also about the kiss. In other words, is this kiss pleasurable? Is it nice? Or is it pasnished? Ugh, disgusting. Don't watch that. Turn that off. Do we want to develop an aversion to kissing?
I think most parents would naturally go to the, disgusting, whether or not they actually feel that. I'm assuming they don't, but they feel that would be a healthy way to raise their child.
Well, it's not.
Gross.
Yeah, but it's not, because what it does is it instills the feelings of aversion. That's disgusting. And we don't want to do that. We want to say, well, that might actually be very pleasurable. However, our value system teaches that that's the kind of thing you do with your spouse when you're married. That's ideally how we want to teach the values, that kissing is nice. And if you do engage in kissing, you want to make sure that you enjoy it. You don't want to just kiss because you're supposed to, or because, he wants you to, or she wants you to. It should feel nice. So, Scott, we've talked about raising sexually healthy children so far in terms of cognitive and somewhat a little bit emotional, but let's talk a little bit more about the sensory and the emotional.
Touch,
yeah,
okay.
Sensory. Do you have a question about that?
Well, I do, because, I am, I've got 7 children, and I'm hoping that I'm inculcating in them the value that it's important not to touch before they get married. That's certainly the value which I'm trying to instill in them, to be shomer negia. And yet at the same time, in your list, you say that acknowledge that touch is a basic human need and that touch itself feels good. How do I balance that?
Touch is a basic human need, and there are several types of touch. There's the original touch between mother and child, the soothing touch, the calming touch. We are wired for connection, and we're wired for touch, and not having any of touch in your life forms a kind of a skin hunger and a difficulty even being able to process touch.
What does skin hunger mean?
Kind of like a hypersensitivity to touch. It almost doesn't feel normal. It's like these babies there was this famous study that they did on babies who were never held in some kind of a orphan home. And these babies, they couldn't self-soothe, they couldn't calm themselves down, and you couldn't calm them either because they just weren't used to touch.
Wow.
Touch organizes soothing behaviors, our ability to self-soothe. And touch is a very important component of development. And if we raise children without touch, it can be harmful. So we want to touch our kids, and we want kids to be able to be touched and understand that there are different kinds of touch.
Can you give me an example of what you mean?
Well,
Aside from parents touching their own children when they're children, or
well, if you have a friend who hugs you and you want to hug your friend, if you go to a spa and get a massage, that feels good. There's all sorts of touch which can be comforting, which can be reassuring. What we generally don't like is, having to hug that old aunt because she wants the hug. And so kind of feeling like you have to be touched when you don't want to. Understanding that that's a different kind of touch that doesn't feel good and that you don't have to do. You don't have to touch if you don't want to. Also, what you were saying about you want your kids to be shomer nagia. Look, I think that we need to acknowledge that shomer nagia cannot be the only boundary. If we tell, for example, young women that they should be shomer, but for whatever reason they choose not to be shomer, we need to really be talking about those choices. Are they choosing not to be shomer because they believe that if you want to keep your boyfriend, you need to touch him? Or do they choose not to be shomer because they get pleasure out of engaging? We need to be able to open up these discussions and talk about them, because if we only make it about shomer or not shomer, we're not providing tools to be aware of your experience sexually, to be connected to it and not disassociated from it, to make choices, to make boundaries, to experience it in a way that is consistent with your values.
Well, this certainly leads back to something which I know just from the previous podcast as well as this podcast, is that clearly a big part of the way you look at sexuality in general and in education is not to look at things as black and white. Once again, to make a disclaimer, that does not mean ignore halacha. That's not what we mean. However, life is complicated, and every consequence has its own consequence, and every way we teach people has to be balanced with other different ideas that are out there as well. So while acknowledging that this is what halacha demands, and this is what halacha says, at the same time, acknowledging a reality, if someone doesn't do that, we don't want them to say, therefore, I'm going to drop the entire edifice because clearly this is not for me. We have to be careful about that. When you and I talked about masturbation in the Orthodox Conundrum podcast, which is also episode 1 of Intimate Judaism, that was a big element that we've seen practically on the ground. And since that podcast was up, I've heard it over and over from people who approach me, that people say, I can't keep this law, so therefore I'm tossing the whole thing in the garbage. And we want to make sure that while at the same time acknowledging what halacha says, we don't want that to happen.
Absolutely.
So Talli, we've only gone through 3 of the 10 tips for raising sexually healthy Orthodox daughters. So I think we're going to have to continue with part 2 in our next episode. Is that okay with you?
That's fine with me. We want to keep people wanting more.
So if you do want to find out more, if you want to ask questions, if you're interested in suggesting a topic, or even if you disagree with something that we said, please write to us. We want to hear from you. Write to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. We're looking forward to hearing from you. And please also go to our website, brand new, intimatejudaism.com, as well as Talli's website, tallirosenbaum.com, Talli Rosenbaum.com. We hope you enjoyed this podcast. Please share it. So once again, Talli, thank you very much for doing this with me. I think this is a great start. I'm looking forward to continuing the series.
So am I.
You've been listening to Intimate Judaism on jewishcoffeehouse.com.